when the empath finally becomes the avoidant after being hurt too many times. There comes a moment in certain relationships when the person who has always been soft, open, and emotionally generous suddenly becomes quiet. Not cold, not cruel, just distant, detached, like a light that slowly fades instead of switching off. And people around them are confused, especially the person who once took comfort in their warmth. Because for so long, the empath was the emotional foundation of the relationship, the one who listened, soothed, forgave, and absorbed the waves of the other person's moods. But then something shifts, something subtle yet powerful. The empath begins to retreat, not because they stopped caring, but because they finally reached the emotional capacity that no one believed they had. And this is the moment when the empath becomes the avoidant. People often misunderstand this transformation. They think the empath suddenly changed personalities or became cold-hearted overnight. But the truth is far more complex and honestly, far more tragic. Empaths don't become avoidant out of preference. They become avoidant out of exhaustion. After years of overfunctioning emotionally, giving more than they get, carrying conversations, healing conflicts, and being the stable emotional anchor, they hit a point where their nervous system simply can't do it anymore. Their body begins to protect them in the only way it knows how, by shutting down emotional availability. It's survival disguised as indifference. To understand this shift, you first need to understand what it feels like to be an empath in a draining relationship. Imagine constantly being the one who senses tension before it even exists. Imagine feeling someone's disappointment before they say a word. Imagine noticing every micro shift in mood, every change in tone, every emotional withdrawal from the other person, long before the other person even notices it themselves. Empaths absorb this like a sponge. And here's the dangerous part. They keep giving even when they're empty. They don't know how to say, "I can't do this anymore," because their identity is tied to being the healer, the stabilizer, the one who never gives up. But the human heart has a limit, even the hearts of empaths. There comes a day when something inside them clicks, a moment of emotional clarity. It might happen after a small argument, during a silent car ride, or after yet another night where they fall asleep feeling unseen and unappreciated. And that's when the shift begins. The empath stops explaining, stops rescuing, stops emotionally chasing. They begin listening to their own exhaustion, often for the first time in the entire relationship. And to the partner who's used to being emotionally pursued, this feels like abandonment. But in reality, it's the empath's first act of self-preservation. When the empath becomes avoidant, their silence is not the same as a dismissive avoidant silence. It's not rooted in fear of intimacy. It's rooted in emotional burnout. They stop over-communicating because communication began to feel like begging. They stop seeking closeness because closeness started feeling one-sided. They stop trying to fix problems because they finally realized they weren't the ones creating them. Their withdrawal is a quiet acceptance. Not that the relationship is beyond saving, but that they can no longer save it alone. Here's the ironic twist. The empath's withdrawal often activates the other person's fears for the first time. The partner who was once complacent suddenly becomes aware of the distance. They sense the shift. They start asking questions. Are you okay? Why are you acting different? Do you even care about me anymore? And while the empath doesn't want to hurt them, they also can't go back to being the emotional caretaker. Their nervous system won't allow it. They've entered a protective mode where their energy becomes sacred, and giving it away too easily feels dangerous. This is the moment where the empathy that once flowed toward the other person begins to redirect back inward. Suddenly, the empath is paying attention to their own needs, their own boundaries, their own peace. And this is the part where outsiders misunderstand them the most. They think the empath is becoming cold, detached, even selfish. But what they're really doing is reclaiming the emotional space they never had. They're finally choosing themselves in a story where they always came last. For the partner who took their empathy for granted, this shift is terrifying. It feels like losing someone who was always there, always forgiving, always available. But what they fail to see is how many silent chances the empath already gave, how many times they held the relationship together without recognition, how many wounds they patched quietly. When the empath becomes avoidant, it's not because they're running away, it's because they've stayed far too long in a place that wounded them. And the hardest part for the empath is that this new avoidant side doesn't feel like strength at first. It feels foreign, wrong, like they're betraying their own nature. They're used to being the one who cares too much, not the one who walks away. They feel guilty for needing space, guilty for being quiet, guilty for not matching the emotional energy they once offered freely. But that guilt slowly transforms into clarity. They begin to understand that their value is not measured by how much emotional labor they can provide. Their worth is not tied to how well they can absorb someone else's chaos. Eventually, the empath learns something life-changing. Boundaries are not a punishment, they're protection. They realize that emotional closeness should be mutual, not one-sided. They understand that someone who truly loves them will not rely on their empathy to compensate for their own lack of emotional maturity. And in this newfound clarity, the empath begins to rebuild themselves, not as a giver who stretches beyond their capacity, but as a person who finally honors their own emotional truth. So what happens next? Does the empath stay avoidant forever? Not usually. Once they heal, once they rebuild their energy, once they learn healthy boundaries, the empath's heart opens again, but this time with discernment. They no longer chase people who drain them. They no longer fix people who refuse to fix themselves. They no longer give love at the cost of their own well-being. They evolve into something stronger, an empath with boundaries. And that version is unbreakable. When the empath becomes avoidant, it's not a transformation to fear. It's a transformation to respect. It marks the beginning of their awakening, their healing, and their return to self. And if someone wants to be part of their life after this transformation, they must meet them with mutual effort, emotional maturity, and respect. Because the empath is done carrying relationships alone. They are done being the emotional backbone for someone who never held them. They are done confusing love with sacrifice. In the end, the real question is not, why did the empath become avoidant? The real question is, what finally pushed them to protect themselves? Because when you understand that, you understand everything. And if you are an empath listening to this, maybe this message is the permission you needed, the reminder that you're allowed to step back, to breathe, to heal, and to protect your heart. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started caring about yourself.